GM Growth Fam, time for another episode. And my guest today thinks that traditional B2B marketing funnels are dead and gross. Well, to be honest, the reality looks like the SaaS stocks are bleeding. AI search is killing website discovery and product discovery as a whole. And on the other side, AI products themselves are facing churns of upwards of 70%. It feels like the complete playbook has absolutely changed. My guest today is Gia Laudi, who is a pioneer of customer-led growth and the Amazon bestselling author of Forget the Funnel. We covered three major themes. Why is it that AI search is killing inbound marketing and how to survive that AI gatekeeper? Number two, why does it feel like we're in the era of mercenary subscriptions, where no matter your brand moat and the relationship that you establish with your customers, if your product isn't delivering, it's going to die, and how you can save yourselves? Why listening to your free users, which can actually increase your long-term value per customer that you acquire. And finally, we covered a 5-step process that any marketer watching this podcast can follow on Monday morning and understand how they can survive the absolute bloodbath that's happening left, right, and center for them. Enjoy this episode, and I'll see you next time. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the show, Gia. So nice to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's going to be fun.
You and a couple of other people I'm going to be hosting on the podcast very soon are really the maestros of, these are the kinds of people that I really admire. So I really appreciate you taking out the time and being on the show.
Thank you so much for saying that. That's really nice.
Lovely. So obviously, Gia is the author of Forget the Funnel and very famously has called traditional marketing funnels gross. And not once, not twice, like multiple times. So I did want to know, because obviously everybody is concerned and diving into AI at the moment. I think AI is disrupting a lot of traditional sort of PLG models, also how people really used to look at funnels. And your philosophy with customer-led growth and Forget the Funnel is honestly, and I don't know if you pre-planned this or not, but it's AI battle tested, where no matter what happens and how much we tend to automate, the real philosophy of that remains the same. The perspective that I wanted to ask you the question on was on discovery. How do you feel like discovery of products, whether that's SaaS or AI or various niches, how do you think from a customer mapping perspective that is going to be disrupted?
I don't think my answer is going to surprise anybody. I mean, it's really what we're seeing right now. I think it's just going to continue to get more extreme where, search is going to sort of fall out and search is going to turn into like a, quote unquote search is really going to turn into more sort of like native conversation, which I think is hugely advantageous to your point for taking the type of approach that we really advocate for, which is really deeply understanding the problem that customers are trying to solve, the language they would use to describe that problem. And if you can imagine the discovery process is happening where somebody's talking through that problem, like literally talking through that problem, and having the LLM be able to identify you as a solution to that is basically your number one priority. Is how do we make sure that, I'm still calling it LLM discoverability because I'm waiting for the kids to stop their bickering and just name this thing already. But it's hugely problematic because I think a lot of teams haven't done enough there. But I think a lot are sort of getting the memo as well. And a lot of the best practices for SEO are really applicable here, thankfully. But there's a lot of low hanging fruit. That's sort of one part of it. And then again, I'm not saying anything revolutionary here. There's lots of people who talk about this, but really sort of leaning into having a very distinct brand and voice and opinion and, standing for something and, representing the, humanity that is your company and the, your ethos, I think is going to be more important as well. I think those are slightly different things, obviously very related, but I think both of those things are just going to become more important than they always were. So again, on the like LLM discoverability side of things, I think that taking an approach where you are constantly and consistently and deeply understanding the problem space is just wildly advantageous for figuring out what should your website include, like a literally down to the, specific tactics, but also how you describe the problem that you solve, whether or not, we're talking about in the background or on the page itself, regardless of what traffic it is that's going to your website. That's the job, basically. Get close to the problem.
Yeah, I think also in terms of just mapping out and understanding the pain points of the customer, it almost feels like ironical at this point because we've been saying the same thing for like 25 years now. Like, go talk to your customers, work on your product, make it usable, make it solve a real problem, and then go forward with it. And it almost feels like every 5 years we're sort of going back to the same principles and repeating the same things. One thing that I do feel is different, though, this time around with AI specifically is then customer mapping itself and trying to understand those pain points, trying to understand that individual context. The legwork that people used to have to do before is also to a certain extent getting commoditized because the LLMs now not only can figure out hey, you have a certain pain point and you're looking for a certain type of products. The other angle now is the AI also understands, okay, what typically do you appreciate? Do you like the color red? Something as basic as that. And going up to the extent of, do you like complex, user experiences? Are you more comfortable with that? And would you appreciate that more? So that individual context is built in to the LLMs. For a marketer, though, who is trying to be discoverable to their ICP and figuring out what those ICP's pain points are and how to talk to them. How do you talk to a team that's trying to juggle this current reality right now?
Just get really, really specific. And that's very hard for a lot of teams, especially depending on their stage of growth or maturity. It can be really hard to, I'm trying to think of a less terrible term than like kill some babies, kill some darlings, and really be quite specific in, I'll say ICP, but what I mean by ICP is obviously like a really, we could talk about just that term for a long time, but get really, really clear on who you're a fit for. Your question is reminding me of like a session I was on recently with a couple of earlier stage companies who were not necessarily AI native, though I think one or two of them were. But let's say, like I say earlier stage because they're in the like 1 to 2 million ARR range, so a little bit earlier, and still like ripe for their own self disruption. And one of these founders was saying that just an obscene amount of signups were coming from LLMs. And it was really, really exciting for them, except that it was a very different customer profile than what they had originally built their product for. So they're sort of in this situation where like, well, do we lean into the fact that we're getting all of this traffic, even though they need a very different solution? So exactly what you're describing. In this case, they weren't tech savvy as who they had originally built their solution for, their product for. And so now they're trying to sort of retrofit their solution for the traffic that's coming instead of the other way around. And so that's why I say the answer is kind of different depending on where you are in terms of like company and product maturity, I think, what you're able to sort of sustain and support. Because my answer to that question would be very different for an early stage product that can change on a dime versus a more mature product or a more mature company that has the opportunity to start segmenting their customer experiences and in amazing and really like honestly at this point like really incredible things can be done now with segmentation. And I use segmentation almost synonymously with personalization, but obviously, there's a very specific difference there, but there's a lot of things that can be done with segmentation that an earlier stage company just like would not probably do. And they would be wiser in their earlier stage to focus in, do a really good job of winning in one specific market and then expanding versus a more mature company. So again, like the answer, I don't know if I'm fully answering your question, but the answer really depends on like, who's on the receiving end of that information, who's responsible for it, what's the skill set of the team, right? Because when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and we all kind of fall into that trap. And so, what are the tools at your disposal?
Yeah, makes sense. But, and you've famously made public about your pet peeve on AI driven interviews for customers. But I did want to understand, like, do you also not feel like in terms of getting to the core pain points, obviously there's legwork that teams and companies have to do to figure out what those are and how they're going to position their product and so on and so forth. But with the AI context itself, like what I'm trying to understand is when somebody's trying to nail down, like, these are the types of people, these are the characteristics, these are the features that we are trying to hit on, and this is the market that we're trying to capture. Compared to what the LLMs have access to and the data points they have access to. A similar thing has happened, as you likely said, but do you not feel like there may be steps that get skipped now or get drastically changed in terms of mapping? Or do you still feel like just go out there, talk to people, figure out their pain points, make sure your positioning messaging is the same, and then go forward with it? What I really want to narrow down here is that AI is really horrible at doing interviews. Okay, clear.
By the way, I don't agree with that. I think AI is horrible at
Your perspective's
interpreting.
changed.
I think AI is horrible at interpreting interviews,
Okay,
not
fair
running them.
enough.
I think AI is very capable of running interviews. If surveys can run capture customer insight, AI interviews can do the same. My issue is definitely not with the interview, the capturing of the data. Obviously, the source of where that data is being captured, wildly important, but I think AI is very capable of capturing it. It's in the interpretation of what gets captured where things can really go awry. And also the source, like I said. So anyways, finish your question though, because there's a lot of potential directions to go with it. But I want to
Yeah,
know.
but no, definitely. And essentially, what I'm trying to hit at is in terms of customer mapping, what it used to be. Like I think to like the Airbnb example of having like 10 steps laid out and you're sort of trying to reach your goal. And if I take the same sort of approach now, I'm looking at, okay, those 10 steps have been cut down to maybe 4, maybe 3, maybe 1, in fact. Like I simply know I want to book a place and I go on my LLM and I look for it. And directly get a link to that. So in terms of the mapping, a lot of that gets changed to my perspective. And I would love to know what you think on it.
Okay, wow, that is not the direction I thought you were going to go with this question. Okay, so this is a really interesting question, but I think the premise of it is somewhat flawed. And that is that, when I describe customer experience mapping, I am describing the customer experience of a business that is trying to build a long-term relationship with a customer, a high LTV relationship, typically a subscription model or some sort of recurring revenue model business. It could be usage based. It doesn't matter what the pricing model is, but the business model is based on building long-term relationships with customers over time. To that effect, like if that premise is true, then that means that the stages of the customer experience also don't really change. It's like the fundamentals are still there. We still experience the problem that we had before, right? We still need to experience the need for a new way, a struggle with the old way. We still need to evaluate whether or not this new solution is going to solve that problem. And then we still have the ongoing value that we expect to receive from that solution. And also, in an ideal situation, I think every product is in this situation to have the opportunity to expand upon that value in some way, shape, or form. None of that changes. That's all that was true 10 years ago. It was true 20 years ago. It will still be true in 10, 20 years from now. So like, that's what I would say in terms of how the customer experience has changed. I don't actually think it has. Now, can you do things more quickly and more efficiently? Absolutely. But, I have examples of teams that I work with 10, 15 years ago who their moment of aha or first value happens within a couple of minutes of sign up versus other companies and other solutions where it takes, potentially a couple of hours or even a couple of days. And I think that, again, it's completely contextual. How complex is the problem? How complex is the team that's looking to solve that problem? And how complex is the solution to that problem? And so it's everything completely contextual. So I think from a first principle standpoint, I don't think the customer experience really has changed all that much, just the tools that we have to have that process be more efficient and optimize it. And I think that, again, back to first principles, we will always be well served, but by deeply understanding what resonates most at each of those milestones. What is the most appropriate message? The right person, right message, right time is still true.
I would love to like maybe dive one level deeper over
Do it.
here.
Do it.
In terms of like, I'm thinking about a future and probably maybe we're not there yet. Maybe it's still a little far off to think that optimistically. But let's assume that everybody has an open claw in their pocket, right? And you're looking at that future and you're thinking about essentially, you definitely can capture what the pain point is right at the start when somebody's looking for a solution. But now the steps leading up to that and the value moment that you talk about, which is my favorite part of the book, by the way. When you're talking about the value moment, the traditional sort of experience that a customer might have had, like, okay, I go, I sign up, I get my first moment, then I do a couple more steps, I get my second moment, and a third moment, and then I eventually turn into a customer and then a recurring customer. A lot of those steps, to my perspective, from a future outlook perspective, now get automated. Now it's agent doing those steps. It definitely has the individual context of the pain point, but the human is not the one that is taking those steps now. So how do you prepare for a future like that? with your
Yeah,
framework?
it's a great question. I have thought about that. By the way, I think we're a ways off from that, but it's going to be the humans that are going to, like, we're going to be the ones that aren't ready for it. And, there's a plethora of reasons why. I mean, obviously the technology exists today. I just think it's going to take us a while to get there. But it's not like we don't have no visibility whatsoever into those conversations. I would hope, right? Like, my hope is that, the businesses that solve problems will have some sort of visibility or feedback from the agent, the whatever, the mechanism, whatever like the LLM is, or the agent will have some sort of feedback mechanism in order to understand where the customer is. Feedback, who knows what those pathways will look like, right? And hopefully we do have enough that we can, I mean, I say hopefully, like, I think it would be silly if businesses were not provided that kind of information and it was a complete black box. I don't think that's ever going to be the case. Even now, you can monitor the chat conversations. I don't know if you have any chat products. We do. I look at the conversations and I think, okay, well, here's an inflection point, and now I just need to update the training of the model to recognize the inflection point and provide the appropriate next experience. So, I mean, is it different? Certainly, but it's still accessible to us. It's still available to us. The milestones, if we're talking about them in a sort of academic way, are still there. And I've been thinking a lot about customer knowledge graphs and how those will serve as sort of like a backbone. I've been talking to some teams about this that are actually doing this on their own, just like because it makes sense to have something like this exist. And for, just to I haven't even completely formed my thinking on what I think a customer knowledge graph must, and like what are the must-haves in a customer knowledge graph. But I am really like looking forward to spending some time. I'm hoping to like take some time off and actually like dive into what these could look like, because I would love to start building these for teams. We do this in certain ways for the teams that we work with right now, because just for context for anybody listening who's like, what is she talking about? We do basically like first party, call it research with customers who have made a recent decision to purchase. They've made a recent trade-off and decision in order to choose your solution. And they made that decision within the current environment. And this is really important. When I mentioned before, like AI interviewers can do amazing things if they're capturing data from the right people. And so we find that the best sort of starting point for, capturing that data and that learning is people who have made a recent decision and trade off inside of this market, this competitive landscape. And when we can learn from them, we obviously leverage jobs to be done in terms of a methodology for making sense of what we learn from them, which gives us a documentary-like understanding of what was going on before, how they made this decision, what they're able to do now. And then CLG, customer-led growth, is essentially the operationalizing of that and turning, or the orchestration of that intelligence, right? And so there's lots of ways that you can orchestrate it. And the most straightforward way to orchestrate it is map the customer experience, give your team the opportunity to dive into like, what does it feel like to have this problem? What does it feel like to search for a solution to that problem? What are the things that people are doing, thinking, and feeling at all of these milestones? And so it's not a stretch of the imagination to take the jobs to be done, take those milestones and turn them into a markdown file that, your agent or AI or whatever, tool you're using can use as a backbone for making decisions. And so that's what I mean by customer knowledge graph. And some people are doing little bits and pieces of this. We're supporting the teams that we work with, ask for little bits and pieces of this. And so we are doing that. But again, it's bits and pieces. There's no sort of solution that I know of right now that plugs into a knowledge graph. There's lots of people working on this, TBD on whether or not they're going to be useful or not.
Yeah, I love that word customer knowledge graphs. I feel like at least the people who have obsessively dived into AI are now understanding these bits and pieces that were so traditionally just known by engineers and programmers. Only they used to talk about knowledge graphs. It used to be such a nerdy thing, and now everybody's looking into it. Wonderful.
Well,
You know,
because they have to plug into each other, right? The connection point between the market and the experience, layer and the technology is closer than it's ever been. Like, imagine we can't keep operating the way we have been for the last 10, 20 years anymore. There has to be the space between them basically needs to be zero.
yeah. Do you also feel like when you do talk about customer knowledge graphs and trying to understand better with the tools that you have now, that you can also self build with the business context in mind? Because I see a lot of, especially like growth stage companies doing this, where they're building their own knowledge graphs and figuring out where user pain points are. Do you feel like this will only be sort of like internal tool that teams who have the resources to build one do so? Or do you feel like there's going to be another SaaS product that does this for people at scale?
I mean, there already are. There are
Yeah.
tools that are attempting to do this.
Can you name a few, for example?
That's why I say, like, jury is out, and that's why I don't wanna name them, because jury is out. I have been looking at a number of them. One that I will name that I think does an excellent job is They Do, which is their solution. I mean, you can think about it as, customer journey mapping for very, very complex organizations and very complex sort of I'll say situations, mostly because in some cases it's like insurance companies and in others it's like B2C, like sort of consumer products. So they are thinking about it at that level. They do a great job. Their material is incredible. Yoakum, the founder, he and I are very philosophically aligned on all of these things, and he's actually building software to do this. I've seen a number of other ones that promise to not only orchestrate the insight, but also capture the insight. And that's where I see things kind of fall down a little bit. But also they do, and even other solutions. I mean, when we're talking about startups, like tech startups, small teams of maybe 5, 10, 50 people, you can imagine how quickly solutions like that turn into like strategic quicksand that you can't even act on, let alone actually orchestrate and use and practice. Maybe if you're building from the ground up, which is an incredible opportunity, but realistically in practice right now, the teams that I talk to on the daily, there is no way they are ready for a solution like that. Obviously, that is going to change, but that's been my experience with it so far. I think that the depending on the makeup of your engineering team or even potentially your product team, I think the answer to that question is also very different, right? It depends on uh, the I don't want to say maturity, but it's almost the other way around. It's almost not maturity is almost a liability in this situation.
Yeah, makes sense. The other thing I was curious about was the whole concept of like zombie ARR. And what used to happen was you would get a SaaS tool, you pay a subscription. It's like they would be invoiced for like a year or two and not even realize what they were getting built for unless somebody did a deep dive into it. I've had at least my fair share of experiences with that. What I was curious to know now is we've almost gone into an era of mercenary subscriptions where it's like you have to be completely rootless about making sure that your product is top of mind and really is solving a pain point and not lagging behind. So essentially what I'm trying to understand is two things that are happening at the same time. One is that for the companies that do have the resources to build their own tools, they're trying to figure out, okay, let's say what kind of a stack or framework is going to get me closest to the kind of result that I'm looking for. Now you can use an OpenAI model on top of two other tools that get to the solution that you're trying to get
Oh,
to.
okay. Sorry.
Which
Yeah.
traditionally speaking used to be you pick one SaaS tool that solves one problem and you have another SaaS tool that solves another problem.
Yeah.
And that generally led to the zombie ARR problem because you were just so used to using those tools that you ended up sustaining that subscription. But now, because you're building your own tools, the idea has become I want to be in the frontier all the time,
Mm.
especially if I'm customer facing. So I need to make sure that the capital is being spent one efficiently, two on the things that are going to lead us to the output that we want. So
Are you
that was
talking
the
about a technical buyer or a business buyer? Because I feel like the
technical
answer to
buyer.
this question is
Yeah,
very
I'd say technical buyer. Yeah, definitely technical buyer.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot more talk about like composable stacks, right? Like modular systems, I think is definitely going to be the way of the future again, right? Like we're back, I guess, right? This is all very cyclical. We've worked with a number of companies that are actually like squarely in that category where once upon a time, it was only, the nerdiest of the nerds that would choose a solution like that. But now it's becoming criteria, like purchase criteria. And I think that that makes a ton of sense. Like, I think that it's a positive thing for sure. If on the other hand, we're talking about like a business buyer, like, which is what I thought you were referring to, like a company adopts, OpenAI, like they give all of their employees ChatGPT or Claude, that's a very different thing, I think. Much easier to move away from than previously believed. I had my own moment with this, actually. I've used ChatGPT, obviously started using it as soon as it was available. So I built up like 3.5 years of sort of history in there. And then at the end of 2025, I was like, I'm done with OpenAI. And so I'm like, okay, I'm moving, and this is going to be really scary. Holy shit, was it not scary at all? It was like the easiest transition I think ever. I could hardly believe how easy it was to fire ChatGPT and hire Claude. Like, wow. So to your point, yeah, I think that, at the organizational level, I think it's going to be very slow. At the individual level, I think it's like lightning fast. But again, for a technical buyer, very different scenario, more important, I think, than it has been in the last, I'll say 10 years. But again, I think it's just potentially back. Like if you asked an engineer from 20 years ago, they'd be like, yeah, no shit. Like we always knew this. So yeah, I don't know if that answers necessarily your question about, churn. I think at the end of the day, from a business perspective, who's selling into these buyers, you're not looking for, you're not looking to solve a temporary problem. You're looking to solve a critical problem that there is a high urgency to solve that problem, a high willingness to pay to solve that problem, and a durable problem that isn't going to go away just because the technology changes. And I think if you do those three things really well, like if the problem that you solve and how you solve it does those three things very well and addresses those needs, you won't have the zombie subscription, problem. Now, are there tools that exist today that don't do all of those things amazingly well, that are at risk because they're a set it and forget it kind of tool? Absolutely. And every single one of those teams that we've worked with, we've identified ways to stay close to the customer, provide value throughout that, like when you get to that critical engagement, milestone in your relationship with your customer, where like ongoing value being delivered is hyper important because churn is starting to creep up. We always find that there is always an opportunity to build on that relationship that you have with that customer. You just got to look for it. And typically when we do the type of research that we do, it becomes very obvious, and it's not actually all that complicated to solve. It could be, a key feature and monthly updates. I'm being really lazy here. Transactional type of communication that keeps you close to your customer so that you're not a low consideration. We work with a lot of tools that are considered low consideration because by their very definition, you're not supposed to be logging in every day. Success is the set and forget it. And those solutions, I would say, you have to be creative, but there's absolutely a solution to that. And it might mean that your product roadmap needs to change a little bit, and that should be a-okay. We need to be making brave choices right now with our roadmap.
I have like 500 questions I want to ask you just on that, but I digress. One thing, let's say if you were advising OpenAI or Anthropic, for example, and, let's assume for a moment that these teams thought that the brand moats that they build, and for somebody like you, even for somebody like me, I had the exact same experience. I've been using ChatGPT for 3 years, paid subscriber, switched to Anthropic. So for teams like that traditionally thought, hey, if we build a great product and people love it and people keep using it, and we build that kind of a relationship because it really feels more like a relationship with a LLM company than anybody else. For somebody who's built that and thought about that and implemented that strategically, and you're looking at it from a customer mapping perspective, like, okay, now, thousands of people just straight up and left, right, for another product. And you thought, hey, brand moats were probably going to save us. That relationship was probably going to save us. And we're looking at it from the OpenAI perspective, but this could be true for, a lot of, especially AI native companies now who have the exact same problem. So if you're advising somebody like that, what do you do?
So let's make it not OpenAI, because I feel like OpenAI and Anthropic and a lot of these tools are sort of in a class of their own in terms of the breadth of problems they are attempting to solve and the breadth of people they're solving it for. And I'm using the word people real loose, right? the different circumstances and use cases and problems is just so wide, and there's a discussion to be had there. But I guess if I'm thinking just about a lot of the AI native products that have come onto the market in the last 3-4 years, a lot of them are struggling with the fact that the fundamentals are off, and that a lot of their early growth was actually just the momentum of the industry having a lot of interest in this space. And the problem that they were attempting to solve wasn't actually all that durable of a problem. I think that is the sad reality of a lot of these products now. And unfortunately, what has happened is that they've built up big, I don't want to say fat cat. I remember having that actually when I was in house. We're not turning into a fat cat. Like whatever we do, we're not going to turn into a fat cat. Like we have to stay hungry. And I think a lot of these, I'm not saying that they're not hungry by any means, but I think even these earlier state, relatively young companies are riding that early momentum wave. And the reality is going to catch up with them that actually the fundamentals were off, and that, it might actually be a novelty that is way too susceptible to disruption. And in that situation, there's not nothing to do. There's not no solution. The solution is, how do we find a more durable problem? How do we widen the solution and also deepen the solution, versus where some of these are like, I think it would be helpful to talk about specific examples, but without like naming names. There were a few that in retrospect, at the time, they were like, holy shit, this is amazing, incredible. I have to use this thing, and now kind of feel like a novelty, like optional sort of novelty. There are many examples of that from the last couple of years. And I don't envy those teams, but at the same time, what makes me feel confident for them is that they built quickly, they can iterate quickly. And again, like I said, ruthlessness and bravery with your roadmap is the name of the game right now.
Yeah, definitely. Makes a lot of sense. Going back to, I remember seeing this interview of you in April um, on the positioning and messaging of how are you really trying to nail that down so that you try and cut through the noise? I feel like that's just become all the more relevant because really the only time, let's say in a idealistic world, the only space where humans are going to be spending a lot of time is like social media or on their email, maybe trying to read the books and newsletters and articles that they really love to do, and that messaging and positioning bit becomes extremely important. What I did want to know from your perspective is, if a company is trying to nail down, where is it that I'm trying to nail my positioning messaging first? There are a million channels I can go to. There are thousands of, let's say, growth hacks that I could do to solve my acquisition problem, which is the most immediate. Where do you feel like is the first place where a founder or a team should be solving for positioning and messaging from the get go? I know your answers, but I would love to vocalize it for the other people who are going to be listening to it.
I'm almost wondering if this is a trick question, because I feel like the answer is so obvious. So it depends on I'll say business model. If you're a sales led organization, or you're a product led organization, or you're marketing led, or you're in the category creation space, or like, the answer to that question is different. But in general, I think the first thing that folks will think of when they think about their positioning is our website. Now, obviously, that's not the most durable. We've talked to, like, this is part of this conversation, having your website be the thing that people most instantly understand what you do and why you do it and whether or not you're for them is not the end all be all. It's just maybe the starting point, because websites still are the thing that most people will visit in order to evaluate whether or not you're right for them. They're also the place that LLMs will go to get information about you as well. So I would say the website, but again, your business model really depends. Like, we'll change the answer to that question. If you're in the category creation space, it's different. If you're sales led, your positioning lives in your probably your outbound strategy and your website and your sales deck, right? As opposed to a PLG. We work mostly with PLG companies, or companies that have at least some PLG motion, even if it's in addition to sales led. So we typically start with that, like, most critical decision point, the first most critical decision point, which is generally a website. And but again, that's the starting point. Like, everything sort of spreads from there. It's just the first articulation that somebody needs to understand. But again, remembering, like, what's the moment in time that we're framing that positioning around is wildly important. And by the way, like, Positioning isn't an exercise that is done only for the market. Positioning is an exercise that's done for the team. Like, I think people forget that, right? Like, messaging is for the market, but positioning is like this central thing that if you do not get right as an organization and as a team, everything else sort of falls apart as soon as anybody else is involved with your building customer experiences. So it's wildly important. And actually, we did our own research recently. We refresh every year. We'll probably start doing it more often now, but given that we're a consultancy, it's a little bit different than in a PLG. But what we noticed in 2025 versus 2024 is a lot of folks in 2024 were like, we don't even know who we serve anymore. We don't know enough about our market to make good decisions. That was 2024. In 2025, we have an acute growth challenge. Something's broken. And many times what they recognize, founders mostly or heads of product generally are those that reach out to us. What they recognize about half the time is that their growth challenge is actually a positioning problem. And their positioning problem is actually your market has fucking changed problem and you haven't caught up. And so it's this like Russian doll or like layers or, onion peels or whatever you want to call it. But like, that's actually like your growth problem is actually a positioning problem. And that's actually why April and I did that podcast episode together as well, because people conflate positioning and messaging together and they really, really shouldn't. Messaging is just the articulation of your positioning. It's the bridge between you and your market, but the positioning has to be really dialed in. And I think I suspect that why 2025 looks different than 2024 for us in terms of the teams that reach out to us is because a lot of people are waking up to the fact that like they're not articulating what they're doing well enough. They're not like meeting the moment. And they recognize, I think many recognize that they need to actually revisit their positioning in ways that they haven't done since probably COVID. Like I think COVID was the last sort of inflection point for a lot of these teams for positioning. And I think we're at the next iteration of that now. And so I have a high empathy for a lot of the teams that are like struggling in many different areas across their teams where like marketing is like my marketing is not landing, my campaigns are not landing the way they used to. My channels are not drying up, but like almost, right? And also our website's conversion rate has flattened or is going down. I'm seeing a lot of teams where that is the case. Trial to pay conversion rate, free to pay conversion rate also suffering. Early churn is a huge problem for a lot of teams right now, let alone the like slow sort of drip of death on the for longer term sort of retention, like actual churn, but early churn is a big issue. Website conversion rates are a big issue, and marketing itself, like driving traffic. Driving traffic, just to sort of backpedal on that a little bit, I don't actually think that driving traffic is the biggest issue right now. I think the positioning, that the experience that the traffic that you work so hard to get to your website is dropping the ball because it is not meeting them where they are, because your positioning is not dialed in, and because your positioning is not dialed in, your messaging is not dialed in. And everything sort of like cascades from there. But a lot of it is because the market has changed. Your customer has very likely changed from 6 months ago, certainly from a year ago. So if you haven't learned from the customer who made a recent decision, a decision inside of this market to choose you over all of the other solutions that are available to them, and there are many, every market is saturated, every market is commoditized right now, you are operating with a hand tied behind your back.
Yeah, so many amazing nuggets to distill down to. But really, honestly, why I asked you this question is a lot of, especially startup founders that I speak to, they have a great product. They have some sense of who they're trying to serve to. And their first thought to me when they come to me is, Arnav, I really want a really cool launch video. And I want to do so much in that and like, nail the hell out of it and get millions of views on Twitter and get featured on TechCrunch. And, that's the way my product is going to explode.
I mean, are they just coming to market? Like it's a little bit different, right? If they're genuinely, like really genuinely launching their product, I totally understand wanting to get as big of a bang for their buck as possible out of a product launch. Genuinely, I think that is the right thing to do. But if you have a solution right now, a video is not going to save you if you don't know
Exactly.
if
Yeah,
you if
no,
fundamentals
most of
are out of
them
whack.
Most of them have a product, but really the problem that they tend to forget is they haven't nailed down who they're going to be selling to. And like some of these early churn problems you talked about, and this is really why I asked about the mercenary capital thing, is because really it's becoming symptomatic of the behavioral change that's happening with all of us, right? Whether we are a part of a company or we're doing it individually, is people have become cognizant of the fact that I am not going to be okay with a mediocre product that kind of solves my problem. I want something specifically tailored, absolutely sharp edged, personalized to me. And that's the kind of product I want to use. And
Yeah.
I think that's really the reason why a lot of people got fascinated by OpenClaw, is because for the first
Okay.
time ever, it was like, I can train this, like, I can give it identity, exactly do what I say, and I don't have to have an EA who understands me. This is groundbreaking, right?
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of people really lost their shit over it. But okay. So one other thing that goes back to just circling back to the customer mapping thing. What happens when, let's say, especially when somebody's in that momentum graph, let's take that as an example, and they're getting a lot of customer reviews or complaints, or they're getting a lot of noise essentially funneled into the data points that they have access to.
Yeah. It's happening a lot.
And yeah, that's happening a lot, right? And a lot of that is a mix of, especially because most products are trying to be freemium right now, as has been the case. Nothing new in that. But when somebody's trying to distill noise from signal, and you talked about the recent customer
Yeah,
angle for that, what I do want to understand is, do you also feel like, is there any value in also looking at it more holistically, and even maybe considering the people that are coming into the free tier and maybe not converting into a paid tier?
for sure.
And how do you distill that from noise to signal? Because you've talked about the paying recent customer, but what about the free customers that are also
Sure.
coming in?
Yes. Thank you for asking this because it is a great question. And it is one that I don't think we get to talk. I don't get to talk enough about. And that is that this is when I, make the recommendation to talk to recent customers, that's your starting point. And it's so that you can understand and interpret everything else. So we often get asked, like, we want to run churn interviews. And churn interviews are wildly valuable if you understand who you serve today. Who do you do a good job of with whoa. Who do you do a good job for today? Like that your solution, who does it serve really, really well? Then, understand that and then learn from the folks that maybe you can prioritize the ones that you should have won that you didn't. But I think what you're asking about specifically is like, how do you decipher and make sense of all of the inputs that you have that teams have access to right now, which are many, right? Like product reviews and things like that. Um, because it's almost epidemic. That's why I refer to like sometimes like strategic quicksand, like there's too much. So we say start from a first principles perspective, understand right now in the market today, who are the people that we are winning, right? With our solution as it exists today, who do we serve very well today? And let's understand that group of people and orchestrate and be able to identify them as being like ICP. Let's just call them ICP, okay? Even though we're talking about from a psychographic standpoint, first and foremost, I was actually having this conversation recently with a team that has a very sort of horizontal product. They serve all kinds of customers. They have their freemium product is very, very, very generous. And they've got a massive tool of free users and a much smaller pool of paying customers. And they asked exactly the same question that you just did. And the answer is like, identify that ICP from a psychographic standpoint first. Then once you understand them from a psychographic standpoint, now let's look at the firmographics, demographics, technographics, that sort of like look at those patterns and be able to build a more fully, fleshed out sort of ICP or, ideal customer profile around that customer so that we can then figure out, okay, so that's who we serve well today. Let's solve for them well. Let's get more of them. Let's optimize our website for them. Let's optimize our onboarding experience for them, even institute segmented onboarding experiences for them. Nothing in there is revolutionary. And now once we've got that in place and we have that understanding, either with a separate team or put one foot in front of the other, when we've done a good job of standing that up, Now we explore the adjacent opportunity. How do we lose fewer of the customers that we should be retaining? What does that profile look like? Do we solve their problem, right? Is there something that we could do in onboarding that would help them get to value more quickly and then we wouldn't lose them? Because they are a good fit and we haven't done these few things, or they're free users. And we often recommend doing, actually, is after you've done this more like foundational research, is actually then going to your free user base and learning from them and trying to figure out like what were their jobs to be done when they started using the solution, and are any of them, I mean, this is crass to say, but like, are any of them monetizable, right? And if they're not, well, then what other value could they potentially provide the business in a way that, continues to provide value to them? And this is like, there's nothing new there either, right? That's where freemium sort of got its legs, right? Was in that model. So like, there's lots of opportunity to learn and optimize. There's no shortage of opportunity for any of the teams. Every single team that comes to the front door, I'm like, chomping at the bit to take advantage of even just the first 5 opportunities that they have. But I think the biggest challenge and the thing that teams need to remember, especially right now, is that the fundamentals have to be in place in order to capitalize on those opportunities. And many teams have to reevaluate that foundational, like those fundamentals have probably changed from 6 months ago, certainly 12 months ago. And so get your house in order and then layer on top to either expand into new markets, acquire more of the customers, win back, customers, or re-engage, or actually acquire some of the free customers that you have. Again, there's so much opportunity on the table. It's just like having the discipline. And this is what I think a lot of teams are missing right now, is discipline. And also, once they learn, the bravery. And I've mentioned that a number of times because my heart breaks for some of the teams that we work with that know they need to change, their product roadmap. Some real things have to change in their core product, and they have a hard time prioritizing that, or there's too much legacy in place. Like, my heart breaks for those teams. So again, discipline, bravery, you got this.
That's awesome summary on that. I was going to ask you actually on, especially from the legacy frameworks and metrics perspective.
Mm.
You've obviously tackled this problem tons of times for companies that are, say, traditional funnel focused and then transitioning into customer led growth. And really, what I find extremely fascinating with that is this is not like startups. This is like companies who've been around for like 10 years or more, maybe even.
Many.
And they've been focusing on business focused outcomes and not on customer value, and boom, you're plateaued or you're stagnant or things are not working. But I do want to ask you, like, what is the trickiest thing to do for, like, when you do tackle a situation like that?
Oh, that's a great question. There are a number of things. I'm trying to think of what is the hardest. Like, every team is so different. I think challenging the product roadmap is very hard. Historically has never been something that we have aspired to do. That's never been our goal, was to influence the product roadmap. Unfortunately, right now, a lot of the feedback and the learnings that we're bringing to teams, they're seeing the writing on the wall that, like, actually their product roadmap genuinely needs to change. And that's very hard thing to do. I wanted my answer to be repositioning a company is hard, but it's not. I don't find, especially when we have the right people in the room, that repositioning a company is that hard, because I think people are very convinced when the data is staring them in the face, right? When they've got the evidence staring them in the face, I think that there is a big appetite to reposition. We don't actually experience that much pushback when it comes to when we actually are making repositioning recommendations. They're like, this is right. We need to do this. Because in that situation, what it means is, like, especially when the positioning is like strong and there's a confidence. And when I say strong, I mean like in the market, because the product stands up in the current market. We just like need to position it differently so the market understands that. That's easier than if the positioning is actually not as strong because the product itself needs help. That's way harder. And so that's why I say, like, when the actual product roadmap needs to be reimagined. That is a massive mindset shift, oftentimes for the founding teams, for the head of product, for a CTO, a CPO, the CEO. That can be very hard when you're telling them, like, your product is not actually going to survive the next 2 years unless you XYZ with your product. That shit's hard.
Yeah, definitely. I also think like the funniest thing is no matter how much we try to automate, optimize, operationalize a lot of the functions that happen within a business, the funny thing is that the hardest part is probably going to be convincing the humans that they were wrong. It's so simple, right? Like no matter how much we progress within the tech, the essentially it boils down to that a lot of the
Yeah.
times.
And a group of people, because
Yeah.
because none of these teams are operating, they're not solo founders, right? And so sometimes it'll happen where one person is like, yep, okay, this is what we're going to do, or I knew it, right? Like one of them feels validated because they had the same thought and they were, trying to validate the direction, and somebody else did. So yeah, it's like humans interacting with humans is the interesting part about business, right?
Yeah,
So
definitely. Last question to tie a bow in this amazingly intellectual conversation that we had just had. So let's say what's the what's the Monday morning idea for a marketer? Somebody who's digested all of the things that we talked about and wants to understand that okay, right now I'm running a AI optimized marketing funnel and my whole world is shattered after listening to Gia and Arnav. Now, let's say I'm sitting in a Monday morning meeting, trying to figure out what I need to do for growth. What are,
yeah,
let's say, the next 5 moves that they need to make to ensure that with everything that's happening contextually,
yeah,
if this is a B2B growth stage tech company, what
yeah.
is it that marketer is doing?
Whoever holds the key to the customer sign up process, if it's not you, buy them a cake, invite them for dinner. The thing that I hear the most is like, I know I need to do this. Of course, we need to do this. It makes perfect sense. And hands are tied because they don't have the influence internally to make changes to the product experience. And when I say product experience, what I actually mean is oftentimes the sign up, just the sign up experience. And if you're familiar with my stuff, then you might recognize me saying this, Arnav, that if you can capture some information at sign up about what led people to your front door, what led them to sign up, you will be so much better off. Even if you do nothing with that information, if you just capture it, have it be an open text field. Eventually, you can turn it into a drop down. It sounds so rudimentary, and it is. It's so basic, but we just have we have very little visibility into where our signups are coming from. So if you can get insight into who's actually signing up today, and also if you can get insight into who's actually visiting your website and look at the discrepancy between the two, and then who's actually signing up and paying, like who are you actually successfully acquiring as a customer who actually activates and adopts your product, those three inflection points and learning from them and the differences between them are wildly, wildly informative. Now, obviously, the fastest path is to actually do like genuine first party research, get them on a 20-minute call. And I do run jobs interviews, and like that's your fastest path. But the lowest, probably like the lowest lift thing to do would probably be to just like add some sort of capture on like what are people trying to accomplish at sign up website visitors, and also like those customers that you've successfully acquired. It could be as simple as an email. Just send a plain text email saying like, hey, so glad to see you. Can you tell me about what was going on that led you to sign up? Like just an email. Obviously, the more sophisticated way to do that is to actually add something to your sign up. And then start segmenting your onboarding. Even again, if you don't do anything, start segmenting them and just see how they behave differently. Do they acquire at different rates, right? Do they adopt in different ways? Do they use your product differently? That can be wildly, wildly helpful for figuring out like what's that early product experience need to look like, but even what should you be leaning into on your website so that more of that qualified traffic actually gives suspends disbelief and gives you a chance to prove that you can solve their problem.
I was hoping you were going to say, write a documentary on how I fell in love with your product. I love that quote from you. I was hoping I was going to get that. But yeah, I think that's the,
I mean,
that's
yes,
a,
do that. Yes, dude, that's the interviews route, right? Like identify like so that I guess the third thing you should or fourth thing you should do is look at your customer base, look at the people who have signed up in the last 2 months, identify the customers that have paid, maybe 3, go back as far as 3 months, depending on your product, depending on what the adoption curve is on your product, signed up in the last 3 months, paying, and reach out to them and see if they'll get on a call with you and run jobs interviews, but also don't fuck it up. So run good interviews and don't be a dummy, because I see so many teams just like wreck their opportunity to actually get good information from those conversations. If you need to outsource it, find somebody who knows how to run an interview and get them to interview, a dozen or two customers, and you'll start to see the same stories come up. You'll see patterns emerge. And once you start to see those patterns, you'll know that there's something there. And then you can write the documentary of how I met and fell in love with your product.
Awesome. Well, this was far more interesting than intellectually driven that I thought initially, even writing the questions that I was going to be. Thank you for being such an awesome guest. This was lovely.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fun to dive into these topics. These are not typical questions that I get during podcasts, so I do really appreciate taking it to these levels and these areas that I don't get to talk about nearly as much. So I appreciate that for sure. It was fun.
Thank you for everyone who tuned in. See you in the next episode. See you and bye bye.